Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Experience Lounge podcast. I hope you are doing well, and welcome to the very first of our Employee Experience Bites or EX Bites, a new series that we're launching to provide kind of shorter form content to address some of the EX challenges you might be having and to provide some tips and tricks from us on all sorts of EX topics like EX workshops, EX problem statements, EX strategy, whatever it might be, just giving you some shorter content to consume on the go. So our very first EX Bite will be on framing an employee experience challenge or an employee experience problem. So how do we get to a good problem statement that we want to solve for our employees? So a little bit of an introduction here. Why does this matter? So in brief, a lot of the time I see a few challenges with broad EX challenges or problem statements, ones that are far too vague or they're too big for us to really move the needle on. So for example, we want to improve our onboarding experience. Great, but that is too broad for us to really be able to come up with solutions that will address the real problems with the onboarding experience. So what we want to do is go through a process to refine that problem statement and to come up with, I guess, what we would call subcategories of that particular experience challenge. And then we'll go after each of those challenges individually. So really refining the problem statement so that we can come up with targeted solutions that actually show progress and move the needle for our employees in a much more agile way. So I find that this works really well as well. If you're looking to do a bit of a proof of concept on experience design work, coming up with a really nice, concise EX problem statement will work really well for you. In terms of who does this, typically this would be the employee experience owner. So if you're an EX lead or you're the head of employee experience or you're an EX designer in an organization, this could be something that you do. But also if you're not, if you're just a major stakeholder in a particular experience, you can also own this process as well. So hopefully this is useful for you too. So caveat as well, before I get into it, there are always different ways of doing things. So what I'm going to present to you today is a framework that's worked really well for me and has worked really well for me when I've engaged with my clients to refine their problem statements as well. So do your own research, but also feel free to share with us what works for you or if you're using alternative frameworks to the ones I referenced today. So first things first, what comes before problem framing? So the first thing to acknowledge is there's normally a trigger. So normally we get to this point because we have seen something in either some survey data. So for example, we've seen a dip in a particular experience on our quarterly pulse surveys or however frequently you run your surveys, or we have some interesting data emerging in our experience surveys. So things like promotion experience surveys, performance review experience surveys, or onboarding experience surveys. We often see this in. And so we start to see an interesting trend and we want to kind of deep dive and dig into, okay, well, why is this starting to dip? Or why is the feedback maybe not so good in this particular area? And so that tends to be an internal trigger. So we're doing this based on kind of surface level feedback that we want to deep dive on. But there could also be a couple of other triggers as well. So it could be organizational strategy. So the organization could be moving towards a fully hybrid working model, for example, and therefore we want to do a deep dive on what some of the challenges are with that hybrid experience. Or there could be external factors as well. So as we have seen with the pandemic, there are certain things that are out of our control, but those things certainly do create experience challenges that we might want to address as well. So the trigger typically comes internally from the data or the feedback that we receive, but it could also just come from a kind of shift in organizational strategy or the external environment as well. Now, once you've had that trigger, before you get into problem framing, as with the design thinking methodologies we talk about all the time on this podcast, you want to go out and do that kind of understanding, that empathize phase, and you want to go out and capture as much feedback from your employees as possible. So to come back to the example, let's say it's the onboarding experience. We're starting to see a dip in the onboarding experience survey results that we're getting. You know, the experience isn't satisfying our people as much. We want to go and do a deep dive on that. So that could look like a focus group, a more detailed survey. It could be one-to-one interviews with particular stakeholders that are referenced, or it could be observation as well in a kind of different use case. So maybe not onboarding, but something else where observation is required. I won't go into loads of detail on that EX research piece. I'll address that in a separate EX bite, or Laura will address it in a separate EX bite. But that research is really important. So you're kind of going in with a bit of a hypothesis, and then you're going in to do a bit of a deep dive with employee stakeholders to really understand what the problems are. You want to be going into that EX research phase with an open mind, which is why you don't want to frame your problem statement before you do that research, because what is so beautiful about employee experience research is it will likely uncover things that you hadn't thought about, or maybe things that you weren't expecting. And so really conducting that EX research piece pre-problem framing means you're going in with an open mind and you're really gathering a rich set of data that will help you shape the right problem statements or EX challenge statements. So you've done that, you've got the trigger, you've done your EX research, you're now ready to come up with your problem statements for this particular experience. And so, as with everything, I'm going to advocate a workshop here because I think workshopping these things is a really fantastic way of getting lots of people involved and coming up with really great ideas. So you want to workshop this workshop for problem framing, depending on the size of the organization, the complexity of the experience, is typically around 2.5 hours. And that is just problem framing. That is not coming up with solutions. So you really want to afford enough time to this to allow people to collaborate effectively and to be aligned on the problem statements at the end. So 2.5 hours, you want to involve all the key stakeholders involved in that experience. So if I come back to the onboarding experience example again, we're talking about potentially your facilities teams, your IT teams, key HR teams that are involved in the process. Basically anyone that has a role to play in the execution of that experience, you want to involve them. And not employees at this stage because you've gone out and done that employee experience research. However, I have seen workshops where employees have been involved and that also works really, really well. So again, just depends on the type of organization you have and the kind of discussion you want to foster as well. So you've got those people in the room, they're ready to workshop. It could be 10 stakeholders, it could be 15 stakeholders. It really doesn't matter too much. The more ideas, the better, but of course not too many stakeholders so that it just becomes a complete nightmare to manage and facilitate. So once you've got people in the room, you've got that workshop kicked off, first of all, you want to allow them to reflect on the feedback. So if you have done that research, you present that research back to them, you tell them what employees are saying. So presenting your findings and taking a good amount of time to do this, but also giving them a good amount of time to ask questions, to have some kind of shared dialogue in the workshop, reflect on it, provide any commentary they feel is necessary. It's really important to remember that sometimes the feedback won't always be positive. So you want to give people the space they need to kind of reflect on it, really consider it and come up with any questions they have as well around your methodology or questions they might have about the research findings altogether. So you want to do that reflect part. That really sets us up nicely. It kind of sets the context for this being very experience-led and employee experience-led and prioritizing the opinions of our people. Once you've done that, you're then going to go to the next exercise, which works really well, which is context setting. And this is about getting people aligned on what we're trying to achieve with this experience. So there are 3 questions here that you want people to work on either as a big group or in small groups and then come back together. And they are, 1, who does this impact? So really honing in on who are the personas that we're talking about here as it relates to this experience. The second is, how does it work today? So being really clear with maybe a kind of rough and ready experience journey map. How does this experience work today? What does this look like for our people as it is today? And that's really beneficial to make sure everyone's clear on the experience touch points. Then the third question that you want to answer during this context activity is, what do we want to achieve with this experience? So what's the aspiration here? And getting people aligned on what it is we want to achieve with this experience is just a really nice way of making sure that we're all on the same page and that we're all working towards the same great experience outcomes. Then you can get into problem framing, and this is the fun part, if you like. So you've done the reflection, everyone's clear on the findings of the research, everyone's clear on the context, they know what this experience looks like at the moment. You're then going to go through an activity that I love to facilitate, which is Rose, Thorn, Bud. And really this is looking at what's the good, the bad, and the potential areas of improvement with this process. So you start with your roses. So what do we do really well with this experience? So taking time to throw as many post-it notes as possible on the wall around what do we do well with this experience. The second is thorn. So what do we do that's maybe creating challenges? What could we improve on? What are the issues with this process at the moment? And all of this is based on both the employee feedback that you've received. So you want to make sure that people are constantly going back to that feedback. They're taking those insights, they're adding them to the post-it notes, as well as their own as well. So you might find that your facility stakeholders experience some of their own challenges. And so you want to give them the opportunity to go and add that as well to the thorn section of the rose thorn bud activity. And then lastly, you've got bud. And these are things that we don't currently do with the experience, but would be super beneficial. So these are your opportunity areas, basically. So you want to make sure that you are giving people time to reflect on what could we be doing differently, but also kind of extracting any suggestions that you've got from that EX research. Did employees suggest that they did this at their previous organization and it worked really well? Then that's a perfect candidate for a bud. So once you have done your rose, thorn, bud, you've got these lovely 3 groups of different insights. You're then going to go through the process of clustering your thorns and your buds. So park the roses for now. You're going to cluster your thorns and your buds. So starting to look at, are there themes here that are emerging? So if I come back to the onboarding experience example, typically what I see is there'll be a theme around efficiency, so pre-boarding efficiency. There might be a theme around line manager enablement or culture or team support on the first day or like day one interactions. You'll start to see themes starting to appear. And this is really nice because that will then feed into those how might we questions, the refining of the problem statement or the problem that we have with the onboarding experience, for example. So then once you have done your clustering, you will move to how might we statements. And how might we statements are just a really great way of reframing challenges in a way that allows us to think quite creatively about the solutions that we want to come up with. And so how might we questions start with how might we, and you'll want to get those stakeholders in your workshop to start thinking about what does that how might we question look like, and you get them to work ideally in silence for a bit, and then they come up and throw their how might we questions on the wall and we start to look at what everyone has produced. But really it's a process of reflection. So reflecting on those challenges and then framing some good how might we questions. And so here are a few examples of some good, not too specific, but not too vague how might we questions for experience challenges. So first one is, how might we create a more efficient onboarding experience for our new hires in this part of the business? How might we ensure our line managers are equipped with the tools they need to onboard new hires as effectively as possible? How might we ensure that employees who have recently been promoted are given the developmental support they need to thrive in their new positions? And so what you're starting to see here is that the how might we questions are kind of framed by the clusters that you've started to form with your thorns and buds. So you're starting to see that in the onboarding example. If there are challenges with the line managers kind of not knowing what they're doing on the onboarding experience or on the first day, you're then framing that how might we question around that line manager persona. Okay, so it's a bit more specific. In fact, it's a lot more specific than how do we improve the onboarding experience and address the dip in engagement scores or experience scores for this particular experience our employees go through. So then once you've come up with loads of your how might we statements, you want to go through a voting exercise. So allowing your stakeholders to reflect on all of the how might we statements and then allowing them to go through and vote for the how might we statement they feel is the most pertinent to employees. So which is the one that is really seen as a priority for us to solve. And so typically you'll find there'll be one how might we statement that will get the most votes, and then you'll have quite a few others that will receive some votes as well. And it's really important that you're not discarding those other how might we questions. They're all super valid. It's just a case of prioritizing how you're going to go about improving that experience. And so you've got your most popular how might we question, and maybe that's the one that you target first. Maybe that is the particular challenge that you're going to go after first. So it could be the line manager piece. Okay, well, we're going to focus on line managers, and then we'll come back to the other how might we statements that we created as part of the second, third, fourth, and fifth iteration of this onboarding experience improvement. The other way, if you're not going to look at it in that kind of more, I'd probably say waterfall methodology, is splitting up the how might we's. So you take a how might we, other stakeholders take another one, depending on their experience or the capacity they have. You can run these EX initiatives in parallel and address those how might we questions at the same time. It really just depends on the resource and the capacity that you have. So, important thing to note is you're coming up with those how might we statements to refine your problem statement, and your problem statement, your EX challenge, will be that how might we question. Okay, so it's just a really nice way of reframing that problem so that we're coming up with targeted solutions that will actually move the needle for our employees. So that is how I would go through the process of framing an EX challenge, coming up with that lovely list of how might we questions that we can actually address, and things that are pretty specific for us to really make a difference when it comes to experience, redesign, and transformation. Now, what comes after this is solutioning. And again, I won't go through that in this EX Bite. We're focusing just on the problem statement, but that solutioning is the ideation phase. Okay, what are the ideas that we can come up with to, let's say, make the onboarding experience better for our line managers, or to equip our line managers better to run that onboarding experience? And within that solutioning, there are a bunch of other frameworks as well that I'll come on to talk about in a future EX Bite. If you have time as well, one of the things I would always recommend is validating those how might we questions with your employee stakeholders. So going back out to those people that you engage with for feedback and saying, hey, we did a workshop, we reflected on your feedback. These are the how might we statements we came up with that we want to address. Does this sound about right? And I think that's a really good piece from a change perspective, but also just ensuring that you're going back out to your employees and validating that what you've done in your workshop is totally aligned. So that is it. That is our first EX Bite. Hopefully this wasn't too long and was super useful for you, but that is how I would go about framing an EX challenge or an EX problem. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you use alternative frameworks to the Rose, Thorn, Bird or the how might we statements. I know there's plenty out there, so we can share this with our listeners as well. And let us know how you get on, and we will see you in the next episode.